Dilene.
Hola, Dilene, yo soy Mónica. ¿Cuántos años tienes?
Tengo 9.
¡Ay, qué padre! ¿En qué año vas? ¿En tercero de primaria?
En cuarto.
¡Cuarto! ¿Y qué tal? ¿Te gusta la escuela?
Sí. What's your name?
Alan. What's yours?
Kimberly.
That's a nice name.
Yours too.
Oh, thank you.
¿Y usted viene a Juárez?
When I was young, I did, but it's been 10 years. I used to go on the weekends. In high school, we'd go to the downtown and to the bars and everything. That's fun. But not anymore. I'm afraid now.
Hola.
Hola.
¿Hablas español o inglés?
Welcome to Ceci, the podcast where you see what others see.
Hi there. Good morning. So today, what are we talking about? Hello? Hello? Can you hear me? Ceci here. Is anyone there? Hi, my name is Ceci. I'm based in Berlin, and I want to welcome you to Ceci, the podcast where you see what others see. In this season, we're talking about movement. And today, we'll talk about migration.
Our guest today is Dr. Andrew Selee. Andrew Selee is president of the Migration Policy Institute and chairs MPI, Europe's Administrative Council. He spent 17 years at the Woodrow Wilson Center, where he founded the center's Mexico Institute and later served as the center's vice president for programs and as executive vice president. He also worked as a staff member for the US Congress and on programs with migrant youth in Tijuana, Mexico. He is adjunct professor at Georgetown University for Global Migration and has taught at Johns Hopkins and George Washington universities, as well as El Colegio de Mexico as a visiting scholar. His research focuses mainly on migration globally, with a special emphasis on immigration policies in the United States, Latin America, and the Caribbean. He's the author of several books, including Vanishing Frontiers, The Forces Driving Mexico and the United States Together. Dr. Selee contributes a regular column to Mexico's largest newspaper, El Universal, and has published opinion articles in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and America's Quarterly. He holds a PhD in Policy Studies from the University of Maryland, an MA in Latin American Studies from the University of California, a BA Phi Beta Kappa from Washington University, and a certificate in Strategic Perspectives on Non-Profit Management from Harvard Business School. From 2017 to 2018, he was selected as an Andrew Carnegie Fellow.
Good morning, Dr. Selee. Pleasure to have you here today. Dr. Selee, we'll talk about movement migration, and you are the president of the Migration Policy Institute. What kind of institution is this? And what does it do?
So the Migration Policy Institute, MPI, is a think tank. We're a policy research organization, as we call ourselves. We look at, we're strictly nonpartisan, independent, nonprofit organization based in the United States and Belgium. And we look at both why people move, where they move across the world. We look a lot at policies and the effect that policies have on structuring movement. And then we try and do some thinking about what sort of policies would make more mobility across borders easier, better, more in accordance with the generating benefits for people both in host communities, for migrants themselves, for sending communities as well. Our hope is that migration can benefit not only migrants, but also host communities and sending communities, but you have to manage it well and make tough decisions in order to get there. And so we try and inform those conversations with as much light and as little heat as possible.
I think one of the most difficult parts of trying to understand migration is the fact that it is a very dynamic phenomena and that it is full with patterns that never stop changing. I mean, you could have natural disasters, an economic crisis, or a war that could lead to thunderous immigration waves, but also gradual climate changes, economic crisis, or regions becoming more violent that could lead to somehow steadier migration movements. And on top of all of that, there is politics. I mean, how can governments keep up with this? It sounds like an impossible mission to craft realistic and effective policies that benefit all parties involved. How do you do this?
It's really tough. We talk about having resilient systems. You want to have an immigration system that's resilient because things are going to change, just as you say. I mean, you can build something for the current moment, but your labor force needs are going to change, the state of the economy, the business cycle, there'll be need for more workers or fewer workers. The political debates are clearly going to change. And on the other side, mobility from other countries will change because of everything from climate to war to economic conditions. So you just really have to have something that's flexible in place and be willing to adjust over time. And one of the things that I think that has happened in the modern world, it feels like migration is everywhere now, but if you actually look at the numbers, people are migrating more or less at the same rate they used to. About 3.7% of the population of the world lives in a country that they weren't born in. So about 1 in 30 people lives in a country that they weren't born in. It's gone up slightly every year for a number of years, for 20 or actually really for about 40 years, but very slightly. What has changed is it's become more unpredictable. People can move much quicker. The routes that people use, the patterns change much quicker because of modern technology and because of social media, right? I mean, you saw this in Europe in 2015, 2016, when originally it was Syrians coming into Europe and then other groups joined in as well. You've seen this in the Western Hemisphere in the Darien Gap right now in Panama, where people have found a place that we assumed no one could migrate through because it was so dangerous. And now we have thousands of people a month coming through it. And people have many more options when they're trying to figure out where to go. And that makes policy much more confusing and a lot more need to be flexible and to be resilient as circumstances change.
So, talking about these variants and constant changes, we cannot avoid addressing the US-Mexican border, which has the #1 corridor with 11 million people, I believe, crossing each year. And this border is, of course, a titanic challenge, a territory of disparities, yet also of lots of commonalities. We will now hear a clip of an interview of our previous season granted to us by famous Mexican-Canadian artist Rafael Lozano Gemer, where he describes the impact of Border Toner, a large-scale participatory art installation designed to interconnect the cities of El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua.
I made a project across the US-Mexico border where people could speak to each other through these massive bridges of light between El Paso, Texas, and Juarez, Chihuahua. And it's possibly the best project I've ever done, not because of what I did, but because of the tens of thousands of people on both sides of the border that would gather around the wall that is supposed to divide them and speak to each other with dignity, with poetry, with warmth, with politics, with everything from declarations of love and serenades to flirting, and then also families who were separated. And that's what I like. I think a lot about art as being a radio station, right? I create something, but then the programming is made by the public as they express themselves. And of course, that turns out to be political. And that turns out to also be democratic in the sense that we try and create a platform that gives people a voice and amplifies this voice. And in this case, in the case of the US-Mexico Border Tuner project, it connects the two sides of an otherwise completely unfair and problematic division that should not be there.
Oh, poquito. Poquito español.
¿Cuántos años tienes?
60. 60.
¿Quieres que hable en inglés o en español?
I would like you to speak in English.
Yeah, I can speak English or Spanish.
Oh, well, you are more talented than I am.
Dr. Selee, if there's someone knowledgeable about the intense, interconnected, and complex, even difficult relationship between the US and Mexico, is you. You wrote a fantastic book with excellent reviews that, by the way, it is a must-read for those who would like to understand the present relationship between these two countries, by the name Vanishing Frontiers, the forces driving Mexico and the United States together. This book is made out of real stories, which pictures very accurately the transformation taking place not only at the border states, but also within both countries. Would you mind talking about some of these stories that, as we speak, are weaving in at all sorts of levels?
Sure. No, Ceci, that is first of all, thank you. It was a lot of fun writing that book, and that art installation in El Paso and Juarez was phenomenal. I didn't get to see it, but I got to hear about it. Border communities are always connected, right? They're always divided by whatever laws are on the books and by our notion of borders, but they're also very connected. And the U.S.-Mexico border, despite the inequalities, and it is obviously an unequal border. The border between Germany and France, for example, is a very intense and connected border as well. But there's much more equality in income levels on both sides of the border. The U.S. and Mexico is one of these places where an emerging or developing economy meets one of the most developed economies in the world. And so there's a lot of inequality there. And yet it's a very intense, interconnected relationship. You see lots of people moving back and forth legally every day. People come and go. A lot of people live on the Mexican side, work on the US side, and occasionally vice versa. You have lots of commerce going back and forth, one of the most intense commercial borders in the world. And you have lots of people trying to get from Mexico into the United States, either to seek asylum or simply to start their life over, get a job, sometimes turning themselves in to get asylum, but often trying to figure out how they can evade the authorities and get into the country. And so all this is going on at the same time in border areas, right? I mean, it's a story of sort of the daily mobility, which we forget about. You know, everyone talks about the unauthorized, irregular crossings, but there's all this daily connections that people have with each other back and forth that are just part of life in the border. And then for other people, the border is really a chance to move from lesser opportunity to greater opportunity, or from danger to safety. Both of those things are happening at the same time. And it's I think, a fascinating place. I lived for many years at the US-Mexico border and on both sides, and go as often as I can, because I just find it not only a fascinating place, but a creative place in terms of human interaction.
And Dr. Selee, I was reading in your book about Hazelton, Pennsylvania, and I think that is an amazing example of these stories. Would you mind shortly talking about how has this region been developing?
Sure. I mean, Hazelton is a fascinating city. I actually managed to go last year again. I'd been away a bit for COVID, but it's just an amazing city that went from being almost entirely white to being about half, or maybe a little more today, Latin American. Immigrants and their children, Mexicans and Dominicans mostly, but people from all over Latin America. This change happened in 20 years. And so it was a very rapid demographic change. It was not an easy demographic change. I mean, I went there in part because it was the first city in the United States that had tried to make it illegal to hire or rent to someone who couldn't prove they were legally in the country, using municipal laws, and ended up being struck down in the courts. But it became a symbol for people that were worried about immigration, of a city that was standing up against what they would have called illegal immigration. And on the other side, it became a symbol of resistance to laws that were trying to marginalize people who didn't have legal status. And there were sort of two interesting stories that I was following. One is the fact that four of the biggest employers in the city and right around the city turned out to be Mexican companies. And so at the same time, there's this acrimonious immigration debate going on. The four Mexican companies had bought out U.S. companies that were hiring local workers and were major sources of employment. And no one really realized this. And it was not on purpose. It just happened to be some of the big Mexican companies had bought U.S. companies that happened to have factories in the area. And so people were debating the arrival of Mexican immigrants, and at the same time, taking home a paycheck that was paid by a Mexican company, which sort of tells you about how connected these two countries are, and the way globalization works in all sorts of mysterious ways that we don't always follow. And the second story was actually the immigration question and how, after all this debate, there began to be a coming together. And it's still going on. There still is, under the surface, real tensions between the newcomers and the old timers in the community, between the immigrant and children of immigrant communities, side of the community, and those that were there for generations. Although almost all of them, by the way, can tell you where their immigrant grandparents or great grandparents came from. So immigration is there in all sorts of other ways, even the people who are, the old timers. The city is coming to terms with it. It frankly, economically has become much better off. It has reversed. It has was in economic decline. It's now become a very vibrant city, and it's attracting lots of people, and the population's growing again. So in the end, immigration's been good for the city. But it also tells you a little bit about what we go through in places around the world, right? I mean, immigration can be very positive, lead to cultural renewal, lead to economic opportunities and growth. But it also, because people are people, it also means that things around us change in ways that can be uncomfortable, right? And the thing I used to always hear from folks in Hazelton is people saying, I recognize that the immigrants have made this city better, but it's not the same city I grew up in. And you can say that's racist, but on the other hand, it's something about human nature too, that we assimilate change slowly. And it's important to understand that on the other side as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think it's also fair to address this other side of the story. How in some of these local communities in the countries of destiny, some people have become sort of observants of all of these changes happening within their communities without being able to take part in them. A certain community might seem externally in good shape, but underneath, those who have spent their lives in that community changing so rapidly could be feeling displaced, could be afraid to lose their jobs as a result of the confrontation of these new realities, either because they lack of educational skills required to adapt to this new labor market, or because they haven't been exposed so near to new cultures developing in this area. How do governments tend to deal with it? And what role do narratives play at this point of tension between immigrant communities and original local communities of the country of destination?
That's a real challenge always, right? I mean, because, and you're very right, by the way, that the tensions tend to be in places where people already feel left out, right? I mean, it doesn't happen as much in Berlin or New York City that have dynamic economies, and also have a history of diversity, right? I mean, always people sort of living together that were different in some way. And it happens in places where people already feel marginalized, and then other people show up, and yes, it may be good economically, but at the same time, they already felt displaced, and they feel like they're being doubly displaced here. So this is hard. I mean, part of the question is making sure. I think there's a real need to pay attention to concerns of the native born as well as of immigrants. And I don't mean attend to racist concerns or people who are exclusionary, but make sure that people who were already in communities that have been left out of the labor market can find ways of retraining and coming back. I mean, they need to feel like the politicians are paying attention to them. Because otherwise they can be seduced by some of the narratives that say your problem is the fault of the people that just arrived. And I do think there's a huge role for political leaders in talking about what it means to be a country of welcome and what it means to be a diverse country. And this is, I would say, in the United States, where I come from, we have this template of being a nation of immigrants. It's never been completely accurate. I mean, there was certainly forced immigration, slavery, and there were certainly Native Americans here. So it's never been entirely a nation of immigrants, but we do have that sort of mentality. But it's still hard, right? We still struggle in every generation with whatever new immigration patterns there are, right? And there's a pushback to it. And in other countries, it's a question of creating sort of new narratives about what it means to be German, Danish, French. What does it mean in a country that is constantly evolving? And we will all be constantly evolving in the future. What does it mean in the United States to be constantly evolving? What does it mean in Colombia, which has just taken in close to 3 million displaced people from Venezuela? what does it mean to be Colombian when all of a sudden, for the first time ever, 5% of your population is born abroad? So thinking through those things and creating those narratives of inclusion are really important, because otherwise you do end up with societies that are separated from each other.
And I think something that you mentioned is very important. I think there's always like the countries of destiny left out of the politician narrative in terms of programs such as education programs. That because I think also education is the key to a smoother economical mobility, that we know. Of course, it is important, and I would say it is essential to provide education to the migrating part of the equation, but also not to forget the other part, which is the receiving community. I think their education is also key, at least in practical terms, talking about the teaching of technical skills, retraining, promoting the studying of science and mathematics, and so on.
Yeah.
It is important that the people conforming the communities of the receiving country not be forgotten and left out.
I think that's right. I mean, I think this is how you look at all parts of the equation, right? I mean, you want to make sure that immigrants feel included and are in fact included and have the same access to education and public services and rights. And at the same time, also make sure that those that were there before also still feel included and feel that they're not being left behind. I mean, that, and often, we talk about this, there's often an effort to do programs for immigrants. And sometimes that is important, especially during a time of transition. I mean, you need to think about language, and you need to think, and it's certainly very important with refugees, right? And people's ability to integrate into the new society they've arrived in. But over time, what you really want is to invest not in immigrant education, but invest in education in places that have large immigrant communities, right? And you invest in education everywhere, but you want to make sure that you're investing not just in the immigrant side of the equation, but in the whole community, right? And how people that were already there and people who've arrived more recently see it as a common enterprise to make their community succeed, to make their school succeed, to make their economic future together succeed. And so it's a challenge. I think almost all countries are dealing with it. The other thing is, even though immigration goes up little by little globally, there are lots of countries, including Germany, where the numbers have increased quite rapidly over the past 20 years, right? And in fact, many countries, much of Europe, some of that is just mobility within Europe, but a lot of it's also people coming from other countries around the world. Latin America and the Caribbean have had huge increases in mobility, some parts of Africa. There are some places where this has happened. You have some countries like Canada, where almost a quarter of the population now is foreign-born, or Australia, where it's almost close to 30%, where really the foreign-born percentage of the population is quite noticeable. And in Germany, I believe, I can't remember the latest numbers, but it's somewhere around 1 in 7 people. Sweden is similar.
Yeah, that's actually, I think, the second most prominent destination now, with nearly 16 million international migrants.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's really incredible. And that's a change in a generation. That's fast, right? And I think we should assume that in a globalized world, these changes will be much faster in the future, right? I mean, and that not every country will experience it equally, but in countries that are attractive, the countries where people have better opportunities to live well are going to be particularly attractive in a more mobile world.
Yeah.
I wanted your advice. May I ask you for some advice?
Yeah, sure.
I have been living in El Paso for many years, over 40 years.
Wow, that's a lot of years.
It is. I am very embarrassed that I do not speak Spanish yet.
Dr. Selee, back to Mexico and the U.S. In the drafting of NAFTA, and back in the mid-90s, and subsequently again when drafting the USMCA in 2018, which took effect in 2020, the freedom of movement established for goods, services, and capital did not extend to labor. So do you think it was a major mistake to have missed a chapter on labor immigration for all in the agricultural sector, or was it basically not possible at the time?
It really wasn't possible at the time. And I think it's even hard to do now, right? There's a real desire to separate goods from people. And there's a good reason, right? Goods don't have rights, right? So, you can move goods, but they don't acquire any rights. They're simple. People acquire rights. People are complex. And I think it's always going to be hard to combine those two. I mean, there are cases you can see. There's actually quite a few cases around the world where trade agreements have led to mobility agreements, but it's often contentious territory. And certainly in this case, it would have been very hard with the U.S. and Mexico. Canada was less important in this. What did happen is that there was an attempt in the U.S. to increase the number of agricultural and non-agricultural workers, sort of in tandem with NAFTA. And it was done very quietly. It was done in an almost technical way without people noticing. And so the Bush administration and then later the Clinton administration really did, the first Bush administration, the father who negotiated NAFTA, and the Clinton administration that signed it in the end were and implemented it, were the ones that very quietly increased the number of seasonal workers. And they did include a small provision in NAFTA that was about professional workers that has been slowly expanded over time. I don't think it's been enough. I think there's one of the strange things in our world is that, people are very afraid of and particularly upset by people entering illegally, but we're very reluctant to create legal channels to manage this. And so we actually tend to allow illegal immigration to happen, irregular immigration to happen, and then complain about it, but not actually create legal channels that might give people an option and might create some structure to the movement. And so that's kind of what's happened with the U.S. and Mexico is, we do create legal channels, but never quite enough that it would be a meaningful alternative for a lot of people who would love to come at least work a little bit in the United States, maybe not even stay in the U.S., but at least be here for a while.
So we were talking about these rapid changes. So that takes me to the pandemic. COVID has highlighted the biggest flaws, I think, in each country's systems. In Germany, for example, the lack of poor digitalization in governmental institutions, hospitals, and schools, and the urgency to remedy this situation became extremely evident. And in general, around the world, since every one of us became a potential virus spreader, people priorly invisible to the system became visible again. And so with these, the degree of vulnerability experienced by people living on parallel economies, such as illegal workers, was heavily exposed, the same as bureaucracy got exposed as poisoning demeanor of effectiveness and efficiency. So in your view, and you were mentioning already some elements of this, what has the pandemic showed us or prove us wrong about migration, and how did COVID shape, so to say, our understanding of the borders?
It's fascinating. There are all sorts of ways of answering that. COVID is, I think as we look back in history, we'll realize that COVID was in some ways like a major war, right? In its impact. I mean, these are sort of not, I don't want to create a false equivalency, but in the sense that it's sort of disjunctive, it changes everything, or it changes a set of assumptions we have about the way the world works in a way that, change in the world is usually gradual and evolutionary. But when you have a pandemic or a war or a major crisis, it can really change a lot of things. So a few things that changed. One is mobility really slowed a lot to a degree that we didn't think was possible. Certainly legal immigration slowed because governments stopped processing. They closed consulates. They stopped processing visas. Borders closed. But irregular migration also slowed a lot, actually. Simply people's movement slowed. That was surprising. Secondly, I think in some countries there was an appreciation of immigrant workers because food systems, delivery systems, hospitals tend to be places where you have a large number of foreign-born workers, in Europe and North America particularly. And there was a sort of reappraisal in some countries about the contribution of those workers. You even saw with like Boris Johnson, then Prime Minister of the UK, pointedly, thanking the immigrant doctors and nurses when he had COVID and was in the hospital. But there was a lot of visibilization in a positive way of the kind of workers that are often invisible to us and tend to be jobs that immigrants, particularly recent immigrants, go into. On the other hand, as you say, there's also sort of people also get in a bit of a hunker down mentality, a bit of a crisis mentality. And so it also almost certainly, because there were a lot of were winners in COVID, but there were a lot of losers in COVID, particularly people who lost jobs or lost hours of their jobs, right? We're not paid for, full-time work. That also feeds people who they don't know if it's COVID, they don't know if it's machines, they don't know if it's immigrants or trade, but something is causing their lifestyle and their standard of living to go down, and people become much more skeptical. And so I think on one hand, you see a huge appreciation in large sectors of the population about the role that immigrants played during COVID in keeping our lives going. But you also see an important minority of people who actually reacted very negatively and would see immigration as one of the many causes of why things got worse for them. And there's not a direct correlation, but it just in people's imaginary understandings of this, it's easy to blame outside forces that you're not quite sure what impact they have in your life.
Hi, we would love to hear your comments and learn about what you see. Share your input at www.cecipodcast.com and follow us on social media. Oh, I almost forgot. To accompany us in this season's journey, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. And now let's continue with Ceci.
And so according to the IOM's World Migration Report of 2022, there are approximately 281 millions of migrants worldwide, being the larger numbers of migrants moving within countries, and the U.S. being the primary destination with over 51 million international migrants. You've been talking about the challenges that we face globally with migration, being some of them the rapidity and also the numbers in which this happens and the spontaneity in how this happens. Do you see other present major global migration challenges?
Yes, I think there's a number of challenges. So one is simply, I think the first challenge is an unequal world. We should assume people are going to move for better opportunities, right? I mean, this is going to happen. And people have more agency today than they ever have. They have more ability, thanks to social media and transportation infrastructure, to be able to figure out how to get into another country. So one thing we would be wise in thinking about is how do we create the legal means for people to go? Not everyone's going to be able to go. Not everyone's going to be able to go immediately, but begin to create legal pathways. And the German government's actually been talking about this and about how do you begin thinking of some of the legal pathways that allow people to come, because it is important. And by the way, the second thing that is going on in our current world is some of the countries in Europe and North America and East Asia are seeing very significant population changes. Almost all the population growth in the United States now is from immigration, and all of it will be after 2042. But this is true in a number of European countries. It's true as well in some East Asian countries. And so on one hand, there's a need in some of what we would call the developed world for people to come from other countries. We're often resistant to it. And at the same time, in other countries where there are fewer opportunities, there's a huge desire to move. So we need to figure out how to structure that. The second big area I would say is how do we deal with displacement? And we're seeing this play out, in Europe with the Ukrainian crisis right now, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and, roughly 7 million Ukrainians leaving their country. And actually, it's been a very flexible response in Europe. It's been a very fast, flexible response. You can say it's for geopolitical reasons or because they're Europeans or any other reason, but it shows that it can be done, right? And the Syrian crisis in Gaziantep in Turkey and northern Syria right now are going through an awful moment with 40,000 lives lost for the earthquake. But the Gaziantep was really the center of reception of Syrian migrants also in Turkey, and Turkey has taken in a lot of people. Colombia has taken in a lot of Venezuelans, so has Ecuador and Chile and Peru. I mean, there's really been an ability to deal with displacement, but we need an understanding about how we share these burdens, because we tend to, the Ukrainian response in Europe is one of the best examples of actually burden sharing across Europe. But we don't tend to see this. We tend to leave the nearby countries to have to take care of those who arrive. And we don't spend enough time in the rest of the world figuring out, A, how to help them, and B, how to help refugees have a long-term livelihood and a decent life.
We have been talking about migration having so many faces, being a word that can evoke hope and opportunity, but also waiting or fear. Fear of not being able to come back, fear of crime or becoming a blaring figure, perhaps even invisible. These are stories of courage and strength, of resilience and success, but also of crude violence and death. And whether for good or bad, migrating will always carry some kind of loss. Each story has a human face, sometimes inspiring and moving, and others appalling. In the case of the US and Mexico border, this sentiment is preciously and humanly expressed in the writings of a fantastic American-Mexican author, and whose novels and poetry have been translated into at least 36 languages. I am, of course, talking about Jennifer Clement, President Emerita of Penn International, and she left us something in our mailbox. The excerpt we're about to hear is from Jennifer Clement's novel, Prayers for the Stolen, a worldwide success and made into a movie, which has won many prizes, including 2 at the Cannes Film Festival. The selection the author is reading in her own voice is a moment when people in the state of Guerrero in Mexico are trying to communicate with their relatives in the United States.
There was only one place on that mountain where our cell phones could get a signal from a tower that was 12 kilometers away. This was in a small clearing on the way to school. There was always someone there either talking on their phone or waiting to get a call from a relative in the United States. The clearing was our link to the world. It was here that good news and bad news reached us. My mother named the place Delphi, after a documentary she'd seen on Greek history. The sounds of the jungle mixed with the noise from the cell phones, the sound of beeps, rings, songs, and bells that filled the humid air were accompanied by the high-pitched timbre of women's voices. At this clearing, there were always women waiting to hear from their husbands and male children. Some sat there for days that became weeks, months, and years, and their cell phones never rang. Once my mother was talking to my father, before he left us for good, and I heard her say, "I could swallow this telephone. I want you so badly." It was strange to have a man hanging out there. The presence of José Rosa made everyone a little shy. We listened with fascination as he spoke to lawyers, policemen, and judges, and tried to get someone to come and investigate the disappearance of Ruth. One afternoon, in order to comfort him, Estefanie's grandmother, Sofia, placed her hands on his shoulders. A missing woman is just another leaf that goes down the gutter in a rainstorm, she said.
So, borders comprise realities of families being separated, refugees and asylum seekers, of people searching a better future and opportunities. But there's also the reality of crime, of human trafficking for crossing the borders, for sexual exploitation, forced labor, trafficking of drugs and weapons. And this, as well as pandemic breaks, as we were talking about, and also some previous terrorist attacks have, with no doubt, evidenced the need of knowledge production, such as registries and tracking surveillance. So even if we don't like it, the state needs to have control of its borders. And in this process, artificial intelligence, known as AI technologies, have turned to be key. These technologies, used by liberal governments and autocratic governments alike, present us with new challenges regarding immigration. First, they do not encode, but they can also amplify human bases, opening the door to discriminatory practices. They also increase in datification and mobility, can create or magnify vulnerability through a poor data storage due to cybersecurity flaws, and its lack of transparency can result in the erosion of human rights. So, in order to provide a better solution through the application of AI technologies, how do you balance homeland security and, well, also making sure you continue to safeguard human rights?
Yeah, I think this is one of those major challenges that we're going to face going forward. I think the first big picture answer to this is the more we can use those technologies to facilitate movement rather than preventing movement, the better, right? I mean, there's we spend a lot of time trying to stop people from moving, and we might be more productive figuring out how we create orderly movement. Now, when you create orderly movement, you still have to police the boundaries of that movement, right? You have to enforce those boundaries. It's not that, everyone can move whenever they want. You do have to have limits and channels and processes. But I would say, the more we can think about how we use these tools to help us think through how we make movement easier, the less likely we're going to have a lot of the movement that's unexpected and unplanned for and doesn't go through legal channels. Secondly, there is a real need for a conversation between people who use technology and those who are thinking about privacy rights. These are huge because technology does enable all sorts of amazing things to happen and to simplify processes and to be able to do really complex operations and to even let people into borders, for example, or at airports or borders in ways that they don't have to wait for hours, right? I mean, these are, things, the more you can know about people quickly, the more you can sort of move them on. You can make a decision quickly about whether they come in or they don't. So these are all good things, but there's a real need to figure out how the use of this technology is compatible with privacy concerns out there. We all have a lot of private information floating out in the ether these days that are in, some of it's in social media, a lot of it is in government databases, and the more that we're relying on big data and AI, the more that we need to be making sure that it's done in responsible ways. And of course, what happens now is many of the things that are being tried out are not publicly known yet. And so part of the pathway is through having real public conversations about how technology is being used, not so that we can stop it from being used, but that we can make sure that it's used in a responsible and ethical way.
Dr. Selee, to finish our interview, I want to ask you a last question. So, in this sense, multiple global citizenship may be the future? And would this also mean a risk of more disparities between those who can have access to it and those who don't?
Yes. I mean, despite the fact that our image of people moving is an image of people in great difficulty and passing through unbelievably tough tests, the majority of people who move are actually people who have more opportunities, right? I mean, that there's a larger percentage, about 3.7% of the population lives in a country outside of where they were born. But if you look at people with a college education, I think it's 5.6, 5.8%, somewhere around there. It's higher, right? People with a college education tend to have more opportunities to move. People who are poor, have less education, have fewer opportunities to move. And when they move, they tend to move much closer. They often move within the same region in Africa or within Latin America or the Caribbean or within Southeast Asia. There's a less ability to move far. It doesn't mean some people don't do it. We know they do, but it is, but there are a lot more barriers to it. And so there is always the risk that you have a set of people, not just those with college degrees, but those who have gone to globally known universities and are connected into all sorts of global networks, for whom movement becomes incredibly easy, and they may have multiple passports eventually. They may have lots of opportunities to move around, and then a mass of people around the world who have very little mobility, or their mobility is confined to trying to go through irregular channels, right, in much more dangerous ways. So we really do need, in an unequal world, we really do need to police that. And so Jennifer Clement's work, by the way, Jennifer Clement is one of my favorite poets and authors. She's both she's first and foremost a poet. And though she's written a number of novels, but her novels are just infused with poetry. Her writing is poetic, but she's reminding us of those large number of people out there for whom movement is, and as you said earlier, I mean, movement is always hard. Crossing international boundaries you always leave something, often family, but, customs and a way of life, and to start something else. It's hard for everyone, but it's particularly hard for those who don't have access to moving legally, who may not have documents where they've moved, who may not be able to come home for years because they can't come back again if they do. I mean, we need to figure out a way that mobility does not become legal mobility around the world does not become something that is only for the already well off.
Yes, I think the most important thing we talk about today is the need of education. In every aspect, it is so important, and it benefits all parties involved. Both the country of origin as well as the recipient country shall be getting into this. And also important is what you pointed out regarding global citizenship, and in general, everything that helps us to create more legal channels to avoid and decrease illegal immigration.
Yes, I think that's right. I think those are the real opportunities. And look, I think we should think about migration as a net positive most of the time. It's not always, but for most people, most of the time, this is a good thing. The more we structure it to get the greatest benefit and the greatest predictability out of it, the better for everyone involved.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Selee, for your precious time in a superb interview.
Thank you. Great to be with you, Ceci.
Thank you to our listeners, wherever you are, for having allowed us to share time with you. We will see you next time. Bye-bye.